So let me get this straight. Paul sinned by stealing because of people not paying their tithes.
How many of y'all know robbing is a sin? You know what he's saying? Was it a sin? Was it a sin for me to do this? You know what Paul is saying? It was. You made me sin.
It's amazing that people listen to people like this, and by the way, people are going to listen to this man. And we'll get to this issue about Paul stealing, Paul robbing, him sinning because people not paying tithes. The links that some people go to prove that you should pay tithes when they cannot directly point to a scripture. And so what do? They twist scriptures, they mix scriptures, and this is what we're having. This guy, I think his name is Tom Brown, I'm not sure. Bishop Tom Brown, I think is what it is. I'm not sure. But we're going to listen to what he says, and let me just say up front, he's wrong as wrong can get, and he should not be teaching.
Did you know that the New Testament teaches tithing? I'm going to show you that the Apostle Paul told the Corinthian church to tithe.
When someone says, did you know, sometimes, not all the time, but a lot of times, especially if you've never heard that before, it's a safe bet to say, well, because it doesn't. It's like he's coming up with something.
Surprises a lot of people, because I hear a lot of people say, no, tithing's been abolished because tithing was given to the Levites, and the Levites no longer exist, and therefore tithing no longer exists. Well, the Levites don't exist anymore, but that doesn't mean tithing doesn't exist.
Now, let's be clear. What does tithing mean? What is the tithe? The tithe is a tenth. And so giving a tenth. And so if you're going to say that tithing still exists, you have to say that there's a command to say that you must give a tenth. Again, Paul tells that no one is to give out of compulsion, which if you say to give this percentage or this amount, that's being compelled to give. He does say you should give, but give cheerfully, however you feel, however you are led, but he says differently. Remember, there's a commandment in the New Testament, as he's saying, to pay 10%.
I'm going to show it to you right out of your own Bible that tithing is the New Testament. Let's first of all take a look at tithing in the Old Testament to find out why were the Israelites told to tithe and why were they told to tithe to the Levites. And here's the reason. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 21, and here it is. I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. The reason why God commanded Israel to give a tithe to the Levites is because their job was solely to be ministers. And they were to minister in the tent of meeting and minister to the Israelites. They were the minister of the 12 tribes of Israel. And
so you see what he's doing? He's conflating the two because they were ministers, because they served. Then so too should all the others today who are ministers, who are servants. The problem is, though, if we're going to be technical, the passage speaking about them serving and them being priests, we don't have that today. So his point is that these pastors today are ministers. What about the people who actually have the term to minister, which is deacons? They minister. Are they to get paid too? And I get his point, though. I'm not going to belabor that point, but his point is that, well, we serve in the same function, the same capacity. Oh, really?
they were not allowed to work farming. They weren't to be ranchers. They weren't to be carpenters. Their only job was to be a minister. So I want you.
Why weren't they allowed to do those other jobs? And therefore, why were they then allowed or commanded to get this tenth from these other tribes? Why was that the case? And I think he's missing that point.
To understand the first reason, and basically the basic reason for tithing to the Levites was for them to have a support for their living. This was their career, if we can say it that way. He re-emphasizes this in verse 24. Instead, I give to the Levites as their inheritance the tithes that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. So he again re-emphasizes that in lieu of their normal jobs that you all have, they're going to serve as ministers and you are to tithe to them. Okay, any problem so far? No.
There is a problem. So before we go on, let's go to the passage. Let's put it on the screen. This is, now he said Leviticus. It's actually Numbers 18:21. He says, matter of fact, I have it in verse 23. Let's go up a little bit further. He says, to the sons of Levi, behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance. Now, a couple things. One, he's speaking of the Levites. These are certain people. That's not you. You're not a Levite. But his point is that, well, but we're functioning in the same sense. Okay, well, let's continue reading. I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance. So this is to be an inheritance. Why? Because they could not be left lands or gold or things like that. They've been left this. They've been given this as their inheritance in return for their service, which they perform, the service of the tent of meetings. The sons of Israel shall not come near the tent of meeting again, or they will bear sin and die. So a couple things. That means that others who are not the Levites, they can't come in and they can't serve. So only pastors can serve. But what about a person who's not a pastor? Can he ever become a pastor? Can he ever come in and serve? So if we're going to conflate the whole thing, conflate the whole thing. Only the Levites shall perform the services of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. That's important, your generations, and among the sons of Israel, they shall have no inheritance. So who's this among? The sons of Israel. For the tithes of the sons of Israel, which they offer as an offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I've said concerning them, they shall have no inheritance among the sons of Israel. So this is pertaining to Israel, not to anyone else. And there are some strict adherences for them and for everyone else. It's amongst them. But he wants to make it that since they were ministers, then those of us who minister later, we have a right to the tithe. Now, does that mean that that those who are ministering, those who are serving, that they should not receive something? They should, and they have the right or the ability to do so. But the question is it a tithe?
We all agree on that. Now let's get to the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Listen to what Paul says in verse 13. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? There Paul is showing in the Old Testament, don't you know that the Levites, they lived off the tithe of the people because they were ministers of the old covenant. He says, do you understand that? Yes. But watch what he says. Verse 14, in the same way. Can I hear you all say in the same way? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. He's saying ministers' career is to minister. And because they are full-time ministers, just like the Levites receive the tithe, God's commanded that in that same way, they should receive the living in the same way as the Levites. So what?
But he did not say receive the tithe. Let's go to the passage. This is why these are the sort of people that really do bother me, because they twist the scriptures, one in their case, to benefit him. Listen, you know what you never have to do? If you are preaching the gospel, if you're doing your job, as far as I can see from my experience, I have not seen a lot of them wanting and needing. They get what they get. And so if you lead people in loving the scriptures, which will cause them to love the Lord even more so, I think God is going to take care of you. You can preach this and it won't come across you being money hungry, especially if you're preaching about the tithe. But let's go to this passage. Before we go to verse 13, let's start up a little bit earlier to see what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let's start in verse 3. Paul is speaking about his liberty, his rights, what he can do as an apostle, and compares himself to others, those in the ministry who are also serving the Lord. And he uses himself and Barnabas as an example, because these two are going around at this time together. He says, at my defense to those who examine me in this, do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife? In other words, we can also get married too, even though others are married, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas, or do only Barnabas and I have a right to refrain from working, who at any time serve as soldiers at his own expense? So he's been serving at his own expense. We're going to find out why in a second. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? And so when you do these things, you should receive something back. I'm speaking these things according to the human judgments, am I? Or does the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while it's threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? So no, he's using this as an example so that a person that is working should receive the fruits of their labor. Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it is written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope and thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sow spiritual things, is it too much if we receive material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we do not use this right, but we endure all things, so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their same from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. Now, notice what he did. He spoke about, he went to Leviticus and use that as an example about the Levites receiving their tithe. But notice Paul is not talking about the Levites receiving a tithe. That's not what Paul is referring to. Paul is saying, notice what he says. He says, do you not know that those who perform, verse 13, sacred services eat the food of the temple? Well, what is he speaking of? Well, in that time, whatever was in the temple, the food that was left over, they would eat that. So is that what you're saying? So when the church has a bake sale or what have you, or they have a potluck dinner, whatever, you can get the leftovers. You can get that. No, his point is, in the same way that they receive from the fruits of their labor, so too should the ministers, so should to the preacher, so should to the pastor receive. Now, that part, I think we're all fine with that. It's just when you say that it has to be 10%.
What does the Apostle Paul do? He says, just as the tithe was given to the Levite priests because they served as ministers, God now has commanded that those tithes shift from the Levites to those who are preaching the gospel full time. So when people say tithe is not in the New Testament, are you saying that there's no ministers serving full time in the New Testament?
See what he's doing? He's conflating the two as though that everyone is wrong and he's right.
That's all I do is I minister. I don't do anything else. I don't have a job outside of the ministry. This is my only job.
Now, what he's getting ready to say is going to be the reason why I say you might want to get another job. You ought to go work at a fast food joint. You might want to go work at a warehouse. You might want to go somewhere where you're designing bridges, where you're flying planes. I don't know, do open heart surgery, do something. Don't do this, because what he's getting ready to do with the text in a second.
Are you saying there's not ministers who serve full time? And in other words, the ministers are a reality of the Levites, which are the shadow. And Paul is showing that's where the tithe goes. And to this day, I have not heard one anti-tither be able to explain that.
Because no one is using this passage to say that you should use it as a tither. I mean, to force folks to tithe, because the tithe never comes up. That never comes out of Paul's mouth.
Explain that phrase in the same way. Well, no, you can't explain it. All I hear people do is...
And so now we're explaining it, and it just makes sense. You cannot throw something in there because it seems like it's just like, did the word tithe come up?
They tell me, verse 15, but I have not used any of these rights. So Paul does say, I have not used any of these rights in getting the tithe from you guys. I haven't used it. But here's my point. He calls it a right. Did you know it is the right of your pastor to receive your tithe? It's his.
No, it's not. This is why the lies, the misconstrued words that he's using, the twisting, this is intentional, which is why, and again, a pastor, an elder should be able to teach. If this is indicative of how he teaches, he is clearly not qualified. Now, maybe it's just this. Maybe it's just this. Maybe he's just in error. Or maybe he's just greedy. Or maybe he really doesn't know. Maybe he's greedy and he doesn't know how to teach.
God's commanded that in that same way, they should receive the living in the same way as the Levites. So what does the Apostle Paul do? He says, just as the tithe was given to the Levite priests because they served as ministers, God now has commanded that those tithes shift from the Levites to those who are preaching the gospel full time. So when people say tithe is not in the New Testament, are you saying that there's no ministers serving full time in the New Testament? I'm one. That's all I do is I minister. I don't do anything else. I don't have a job outside of the ministry.
And
this is my only job.
And
are you saying there's not ministers who serve full time? And in other words, the ministers are a
now
reality.
Let's pause this. I want to slide a little further. I want to go to where he's going to go next. And this is just bad Bible preaching. Bad.
But I have not used any of these rights. So Paul does say, I have not used any of these rights in getting the tithe from you guys. I haven't used it. But here's my point. He calls it a right. Did you know it is the right of your pastor to receive your tithe? It's his right. Now, I've had people tell me, well, why don't you be like the Apostle Paul? Don't use your rights. Listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians chapter 11 concerning this. Watch this.
This is where this is mind-boggling. This is where we introduced it, and he makes his point that Paul sins by stealing. I'm not making this up. This comes out of his mouth.
He's writing to the same church, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? Was it a sin? Watch what he says. This is verse 8, I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. How many of y'all know robbing is a sin?
So he's saying that Paul is robbing other churches and sinning because you all didn't pay tithes. Let that sink in for a second. And while it's sinking in, let's go to the passage itself. Paul says, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself? He says, the sin I committed in myself by humbling myself in order that you would be exalted. Paul is not saying that he committed a sin. He's asking, did I commit a sin? No, he did not. He says, because, now his rationale is because he says, I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. Well, this word robbed, wait a second, is robbing a sin? Well, it depends on how you look at it. If we say, for example, and we use kind of tongue in cheek, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Do we think a crime has been committed, a sin has been? No. As a matter of fact, let's put up this word that's used here. This word that's used, let's put it on the BDAC. I want you all to see this as well. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see the definition of it. He says to rob, to sack someone as a dramatic figure of expression for Paul's procedure in accepting financial support. Him seizing this right applies here. So this is not a sin. It's not what Paul is meaning. It's not what Paul is getting at. So going back to here, Paul is just saying, what I did was I took from where someone else gave so that you all would not have to. But I do have that right. Now remember, if we're going to say that they sinned because they didn't give tithes, well, what about all the other churches? Because we have to include the church of Galatia. We have to include the church of Ephesus in terms of supporting Paul. Because they didn't give, the church of Thessalonica. How do we know so? Because Paul tells us, first of all, he tells us why he doesn't do so. If we go to 1 Thessalonians 2:9, he says, for you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working night and day so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim the gospel of God. So he's not trying to be a burden to them. And then notice what he says about to the church at Philippi. He says, you yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel after I left Macedonia, no other church or no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. So all the other churches are the same way that the church at Corinth is. So were they giving? They were giving. They weren't giving a tithe. Were they ever commanded to give a tithe? No, they were not. This is why this is deceptive. This is wrong. And this is it's just troubling on so many levels.
You know what he's saying? Was it a sin? Was it a sin for me to do this? You know what Paul is saying? It was. You made me sin because you were so selfish. You were so greedy. I couldn't even receive support.
You guys were so selfish, so greedy that you made me, the Apostle Paul, sin. This dude, his preaching is a joke. Now, if I guess he's talking about breaking curses, generational curses, which also that's a problem too. These are people that cannot handle the scriptures whatsoever.
I had to rob other churches to receive support. Well, I served you.
So I had to keep robbing other churches. I had to keep sending multiple occasions just so I wouldn't get the tithe from you. But rather than Paul command, because again, in this passage, Paul's not even commanding them to give. Even in 1 Corinthians 9, he's not even commanding them to give. But I'm sending so much so, but yet I'm refusing to tell you to give a tithe.
Paul is not complimenting the Corinthian church for making Paul serve free of charge. He's rebuking them for it. So some of you say, well, why don't you preachers do what Paul did? Preach full time. Why don't you be like Paul? You know what I say? Why don't you stop being like the Corinthian church and quit being so greedy and cause your pastor to have to receive support from other people? Do you see this?
No, we see that you are horrible with the text. Now, I won't go so far as to call you a fraud. I don't know much about you. But you have clearly twisted the text, which have shown that you are at least not qualified to teach in this area, and which begs to the question to be asked, are you qualified in terms, are you able to teach other areas? Now, you bring up this issue of generational curses in your book, so maybe it is that you don't know how to teach, and therefore you're not qualified, which is probably the reason why you're out here begging for tithes, because you have no business doing what you're doing. If you're going to twist the text that badly, mangle it that badly so as to guilt someone to thinking that they ought to be giving 10% where the scripture says, never says so, and then even so much so to say that Paul sinned by stealing from other churches, shame on this person, and don't let someone fool you into doing this. Amen.